Hello, dear listeners. This episode is part 1 in a series exploring a call to integrity. This first part largely is Martin and I grieving the loss of a common language in the United States where we live, and more broadly speaking, across humanity. We share personal experiences and feelings and opinions around the moment that we're all living through. We also begin to unpack the 3 treasures of Taoism: compassion, simplicity, and humility. These 3 treasures, as well as the 4 forms of rest, are key in answering that call to integrity. Welcome back to Language of the Soul, Conversations on Healing and Growth. I'm Ben Umstead.
And I'm Martin Perkins. So last evening I was with a student, and she shared something that at first glance, might be something that we all would go, well, that's somewhat removed, but for her it was very resonant, which was that she was aware that North Korea had a significant force that was fighting against Ukraine, and that from what she understood based on news reports, the Russian leadership was in essence throwing North Korean soldiers right directly into Ukraine's artillery fire.
My God.
Just in essence to gain feet. Whatever number of feet they might gain that day. And she shared that notion that as a mother, not as an American, not as anyone, but just a mother with a son around the age that could go out to war, would be sent off to war. And it was inconceivable to her. And oddly enough, the first thought that came to mind for me was, for their sake, they being the North Korean soldiers, for the sake of those mothers, my hope was that they know it to be a good death. There's a concept in, it's a Lakota word, hokahe, and it has multiple meanings, but in essence, it means today is a good day to die. And if it's a good day to die, well, it's also a good day to live fully, to live a life that has heart and meaning and truth, right?
Yeah.
Some have interpreted that as meaning sacrifice. So I've heard it, in sports lingo, hokahe has been used as a kind of expression about unselfishness. And that's, by my reckoning, that doesn't really tell the whole story. It makes it about service instead of serving one's soul. And sometimes they're not the same thing. And so I really hope that those young men, that those mothers earnestly can feel the meaning of their sons' deaths, that they can feel, well, frankly, like any man coming home from war or not coming home from war, that it wasn't for naught, that there was meaning to it all. And I see so much pain in the world right now, just so much pain in the world. I see so much unnecessary suffering born of stupid, whether it's a lack of emotional intelligence or a lack of intellectual consideration. I just see a lot of stupid.
Do you feel that stupidity, that lack of emotional intelligence, represents fear, a primal fear, the need to feel safe, even for those repressive powers at the top?
Without a doubt. It's desperation. It's a desperate need to feel a sense that there's meaning in all this. And so they're trying
I recall the sense of manifest destiny that, settlers, colonialists, imperialists in the United States would often use this term, and that historically it was seen as this potent, positive term, whereas it really is just a cloak for destruction, a cloak for oppression.
Yeah. So I recently just finished watching a TV show titled American Primeval, in which a woman, a very powerful character played by Betty Gilpin, heads west. We don't know why she's so desperately heading west. We learn during the story, and I won't ruin that for our listeners. And she needs a guide to take her further west. And she ends up encountering a man played by Taylor Kitsch named Isaac. And Isaac is this tormented man. He's white, but had been raised by Shoshone and has lost everything that's meaningful to him and is in essence cut off. He's in some ways broken. I think he sees himself as broken, and as a result has in essence allowed his pain to define him. And so he sees the world through his pain. And it takes the better part of the entire first season of the show for him to step out of that shell. The shell that he steps out of is largely centered around the fact that he begins to care. He begins to see himself in the world around him. He starts to feel connected. And that's the desperation that I believe we see in the world today. No matter what our political perspective is, there's such a sense of desperation and disconnection and leadership practiced without integrity that's purposely preying upon that sense of loss. Whether it's people who can't find jobs that will support their families, whether it's people who are just in desperate search of what does their humanity look like? Where is my sense of meaning and purpose? People are so ungrounded, and in the midst of all of the chatter and all of the angst, they don't really know how to settle in themselves. They don't know how to be. And so what they're left with is desperation. And so they act out of desperation. And I really believe that's how we got here. Here being in the midst of the second term of a Trump presidency. It is a country that feels desperate, disconnected from itself.
This desperation you talk about in the moment that we are in, I think it's really important for all of us to just breathe into that and breathe into what's there beyond the desperation. When my partner came home yesterday, she said, "I'm so sorry I'm late. I felt that I needed to speak to a colleague." And this is a colleague that she sees as an ally and as a friend in a workplace that can often feel very isolating. And what she told me over the course of 45 minutes or so, she was unwinding and speaking from a place of wanting to reflect and go deeper beyond that desperation. But I heard a lot of desperation in what she relayed from herself and where her colleague was. Her colleague is a white man who's 6'4", and he said exactly that. "I'm a white guy who's 6'4". I've never really had to fear anything, and I'm afraid right now." So there was this degree of honesty between them, but it really felt like both of them were just so desperate to not fall into the far reaches of paranoia and fear, like so many of their colleagues, not having hobbies, not having a life outside of obsessing over the powers that be. There was this desperation that reflected the depth of that fear, right? I feel that the desperation that so many of us are feeling in whatever way we are, but it's all a reflection of seeking a common language. This is something that you wrote about recently for the newsletter and for the blog. The common language that we've lost is a reflection of that desperation. And that desperation into itself is us being quite blind to where are those touchstones for a common language. Last night after we had our evening and everything, I held my partner as she cried and she apologized for the way that she felt. And I said, "You don't have to apologize." I said, "You're tuned in to your suffering. We live in a world that has forgotten itself, and you're tuned into that." Those tears come very quickly for her in those moments. And she can be so critical of herself, though I see those tears coming from a place of fear sometimes. Really, there's a deeper wisdom that's at work there. What's so tragic and so potent and so heavy about all of this is that desperation reflects the wisdom that we all have, that we all hunger for in this way. Even the people that are the repressive powers that be, like you noted, that they come from a place of fear. They too want to feel like they have a purpose and that they matter. And yet, the language of violence and the ideology of a death drive is what they've chosen. And that scares me. That that is where that stupidity that you speak of brings up the fear and paranoia in me, the need to feel like you matter and that you're special through violence and death, through unnecessary suffering, as we've both talked about throughout the podcast at various points. It's so potent today. It's so potent right now in what we're sharing.
Yeah, I want to just briefly touch back on something. Half the nation who have supported Trump, some of whom might be listening to this and might be like, there's nothing desperate about this moment for me. I'm celebratory. I'm rejoicing. And I get that. In fact, I was sharing with someone yesterday where we were on that Saturday in November of 2020 when we found out that Biden had beaten Trump. The sense of relief. There's a division. That division is born of radically different ways of seeing the world, radically different understandings of how we're all connected. And while you and I might frame the worldview of Trump as being divisive, and I hold true to that, I won't back down from that. I won't back down from the idea that there's a lack of integrity, that there's an intention to divide, to demonize, to remove the collective we from our language and replace it with a very divisive us versus them. The common language that feels lost, the common language of a mutual understanding, something where we can agree upon as our shared goal. That's what's been lost collectively. We don't feel as if, as Trump takes action in these first days of his presidency, I don't see in his actions the betterment of the world. I see a reordering of power and a realignment of power in ways that feel frankly disturbing. And I could give lots of examples, but I'm not going to, because at the end of the day, if we're going to find a common ground as human beings, it's going to be centered upon a set of values, a set of virtues, a set of possibilities around who we are as human beings at our very core.
That common language that we've lost, I know that there are touchstones out there, and I'd like to talk about those touchstones, what you characterize as the three treasures in Taoism.
If we access our wisdom as human beings, something universal can be reached that all of us can connect to. And that's why in the essay and why in this discussion, we both feel called to discuss the three treasures, which are compassion, simplicity, and humility. If we just consider compassion for the moment, it's why, to some degree, it's why I keep coming back to reframing good versus bad as something more akin to fear in all of its forms. Fear meaning anxieties, worries, frustrations, deep sadnesses. All of them are versions of fears, and recognizing that those are what drive bad actions. And then you throw in trauma, which is the direct result of being immersed in such habitual patterns, and you end up with people deeply in pain. And people in pain struggle to access compassion. And yet that's the call. How do we find kindness? Not being nice. And I'm very emphatic about that. Don't be nice. Don't go out in the world expecting, I'm not saying don't be gracious, don't be polite, but also don't be nice. If you're going to bring that element to the world, bring it forth as kindness. Bring truth to it, authenticity to it. There's been too much niceness in the world as it is. Too many people glossing over to the point where it builds up inside of them and then cruelty arises, meanness. I know that was a thing that happened in me, especially in my younger life. I could be really mean, and I had to learn how to be someone who could find empathy, deep understanding, and care for others. And it was almost impossible for me to do. It was almost impossible to find compassion in myself as long as my heart was worn out. And I touch upon that in the essay as well, from yet another essay that I wrote back in April of 2024, which is what happens when our hearts feel worn out. And in essence, our hearts get worn out when our heart does not meet its needed connection with wisdom. When we're not able to go into what's deeper within us because of the very woundedness that I just discussed. And the spirit of the heart becomes vexed by this conundrum. The heart doesn't know how to be when it's not connected to its depths, to the soul's depths. And so we seek meaning in all these ungrounded ways. And I would suggest that it makes us very vulnerable to a human being, a highly manipulative human being like Trump, who's willing to prey on people's fears in order to get what he wants.
Everyone's not feeling okay, and it's weaponized, as you and I have discussed in our work together behind the scenes and how that's reflected in our conversation today.
Exactly. So when the heart disconnects from wisdom, it becomes exhausted.
Perpetually vexed, perpetually exhausted by being vexed.
Emotionally and physically. And until we are able to pause enough and reconnect with our inner wisdom. And we all have it. I don't care who the human being is. Every human being on the planet has wisdom. And I would offer that that's frankly, a key element of what compassion looks like. It's acknowledging in the other, I know you're wise. Let's talk about what it means to be connected in that way, right? It's, as I write in my essay, an integral component for the creation of a common language and its accompanying dream is a willingness to practice kindness and nonviolence in our interactions. Find whatever common ground you can find. And if you can't find it, call it out. Challenge the person. That's where the truth element comes in. Not in avarice, but in the earnest desire, the earnest call to know the other, to know their heart. Because I really believe that underneath these choices that have brought us to this moment, all of us have at least the possibility for kindness. Pulling back the curtain of my own life a little bit, I was in a conversation with a family member, and he was teasing me. He knows that I'm a progressive voter. I know that he is not. He says, I'm really looking forward to MLK Day. I said, oh yeah? And he says, he's going to take care of us. And I said, take care of who? And I was met with silence. So then I waited and I asked again, take care of who? And it was the language of bias. It was the language of racism. The us is white people. He's going to take care of us. And to synopsize my response, in a word, I just said, be careful for what you wish for. Now, that same human being in the same conversation offered financial support to someone else in our family who's going through a tough time. In this world, there's seemingly, for the Trump voter, there's the people that are inside the circle, the inner circle, they're to be taken care of. And then there's everything and everyone outside of that circle. And they're seen in a selfish and or a negative light. And over again, I see this pattern, right?
Yeah. This victimhood of people who have been in power, this narrative that they are the victims, that they are the wronged, when they are the oppressors.
Right. It's their pain and how they express their pain. Their pain being resentment and anger. Mostly resentment. Resentment at being, I had a student of mine who happens to be a black woman ask me, what do white men want right now? And the only conclusion I can arrive at is that they want to hold on to what is. That desperation to hold on to control. It's why it won't matter whether or not closing the borders and tariffs have a negative effect on the economy. It will allow white people to keep power. They're willing to keep that as the priority. It's an act of desperation because they really believe that the person crossing the border, each new one that crosses the border, is frankly a necessary cog in our economy's well-being. Each of them, from a white person's perspective, is one step closer to white people not being in the majority in this country. And they want to stop this. It seems like a rather desperate act, given what the economic consequences of it will be. But this is desperate people doing a desperate thing. They're willing to dismantle any sense of well-being that we might have for the sake of this desperate need to stay in the majority, to stay in power. And it's shameful. And I don't like using that word. I don't like using that word at all because I find no point to shame. But it's an abhorrent choice. It's born of a lack of compassion, a lack of humility. It's an unwillingness to see the interconnectedness of us all. The importance of a world where seeing human beings through that lens is, well, it's destructive. To see humanity through these lenses of separateness. It's why these treasures are so important, that compassion, a willingness to live simply and in balance, and to step out of avoiding the extremes, of aligning with a sense of harmony, a way of being at ease because our needs at a very basic level are being met. Instead of looking around and going, where's mine? Where's my mansion? Where's my big car or expensive car?
Well, it's a big truck.
It's a big truck now. It's a big truck now. Yeah. Yeah.
That you'll never actually use for practical reasons of having a truck.
Yeah. The irony is that I'm, here at Simplicity Farm, I'm one of the few people in the world that actually could use a big truck. I mean, there's a lot of us out there that could use and do need a big truck, but it's it's funny and tragic at the same time.
And those uses for a big truck, I'm reminded of the humility that you speak of with the three treasures and the wildfires in Los Angeles.
Mm.
And I think it's very important to note a few things about this in context. Where a lot of the major destruction has occurred is where there are a lot of privileged people that live. Yes, that's true. But that is real destruction and real suffering. There are also a lot of displaced people of color in those places. And we have firefighters who are working as incarcerated people to help in a common good. And I use the common good rather than greater good, because a common good shows that humility and that compassion. I think those words are very potent. Greater good, I feel, is performative. I bring up Los Angeles because it's a beloved place of mine. I lived there, and as listeners may recall from our previous episode, the experience I had with the Indies and returning to Los Angeles. But I bring it up because of the common language that we seek and the interconnectedness and that compassion. I've heard so many stories, so many experiences far and wide from friends of mine who are there, some friends who have lost their homes, and from public figures. And one thing that I've heard is, regardless of the social media discourse, regardless of the national news, regardless of the political spectrum focus on Los Angeles, Angelenos, the people that have lived there, they've shown up with those three treasures. Because when something like this occurs, the majority of people, by being human, what else is there than that inherent wisdom? And there is tragedy in the fact that when a disaster happens, it's often sometimes the only time that certain people may really tap into that. I want to be mindful of saying that without judgment and shame. But I think that there is some truth to when it's real, when it's right in front of us. And there is mutual aid in a city that is robust in culture and creativity and inventiveness, despite infrastructure failing. That speaks to those three treasures. So many resources being offered, so many that organizations that are creating mutual aid networks say, we don't have any more physical space for goods. We don't have any more use for these things because the amount of compassion is outweighing the physical infrastructure that we have to manage it right now. here are some other resources that you could, you know, go and participate in, is often the message. It's not just turning it away. It's saying, we're good right now. Here are other people that can use your compassion. And I think that's really key to note in our conversation today. The unnecessary suffering and the gift that can be cultivated through unnecessary suffering when the three treasures are present for people, even if it's fleeting in some way. It's a natural human thing to show up in this way. You know, you talked about your family member and malicious sense of humor, the poking that you described, and yet their willingness to help out. Now, it was very direct. It was very, very close. It was another family member, and maybe they were unwilling to see beyond blood. But that speaks to the wisdom, as you noted. That speaks to the wisdom that we all hold.
So when I contemplate the three treasures and the access point for the treasures, what arises in me is the recognition that the sense of loss that I feel, that I think many of us feel, it's an access point. Let yourself grieve this. It is empowering ultimately if you allow yourself to feel the heart, your heart, crack open and feel the sense of loss in a way that truly allows you to crack open into compassion, to simplicity, to humility.
Through our work this past week, both personally and within our media outreach, the poet Nancy Wood has come up. And I feel so touched by one of her pieces, and I feel that it's very appropriate to share this today. This is From Many Winters from 1974 by Nancy Wood. To be yourself is to be alone with the wind crying when all that you ask for is the warmth of a human fire. The warmth of a human fire is really what speaks to my purpose as a human being, the simplicity of that. And we can characterize things and frame it and contextualize it in all sorts of different ways as we find our expression in the world. But the human fire within, I sing the body electric, to put it another way, with Walt Whitman.
I like that. Yeah.
These are access points.
Right. Even the one that we began with, which was the Lakota warrior's cry of Hokahe, right? The recognition that if in fact it's a good day to die, it's also an extraordinary day to live more fully.
The clarity of that is extraordinary into itself. And that extraordinary quality isn't absent. That's the kind of delicious irony of some of these things. It's not absent at all. Merely a question of how you are holding your own warmth, how you are feeling it from within and offering it in a space of interconnectedness.
Right. I'm recognizing that when the heart feels worn out, it's time to find a restful place. For those listeners open and willing, I encourage you to, either through my book or through the blog, access my writing on the 4 forms of rest. This is how we access a reconnection of the heart's need to connect with it, the soul's wisdom.
Martin, thank you so much for being vulnerable with what is a heavy moment, the melancholy of it, even the shame that you described, something that really is hard to hold because it can be so blunt in its weaponization. To be soft with something like shame, I think, is something that's very important and reflects when it's appropriate to call out in the name of kindness and the three treasures.
To some degree, it's a real fine line between shame and humility. It's a question of how we hold it in our hearts and our willingness to be okay with what we're feeling, even when it's not okay. I'll offer this as a kind of closing from my perspective. A young man who I had worked with returned back for a new round of acupuncture sessions, and he said to me, there's something you said to me years ago that I can't tell you the number of times I've leaned into it as a way to deal with my anxieties and my worries. And it was centered around this idea of being with ourselves when it's not okay. And he says, I've learned and I'm learning how to be with myself when it's not okay. That I can let go of the expectation that it has to be different than it is. I really appreciated hearing that from him, and as well lean into it within myself in this moment.
If you'd like to learn more about Language of the Soul as a consciousness course or an audiobook or paperback book, you can do so by visiting martinperkins.com. If you'd like to support our podcast, you can do so by reviewing and or rating us on your podcast listening platform of choice. We'll see you back here in 2 weeks for part 2 of exploring the loss of a common language and a call to integrity.